and run a good race and maybe set himself up for a proper challenge next year or the year after, because he's still a young horse. Over at the Stayers Hurdle, I must admit I backed Paisley Park to win straight after he won at Cheltenham. He almost lost the race at the start that day. He whirled around at the start, let the others all have a big head start, but he certainly looked his old self up the hill. I'm pretty sure they come up the same hill in the Stayers, so that should be all right. And yeah, there's been a lot of the others have sort of beaten each other. Flooring Porter, the horse you mentioned, is shortened in the market without even running because Classical Dream lost his prep race. Champ, who was high in the market, was beaten by Paisley Park. And I must admit, I can't see why Champ is still shorter in the market than Paisley Park. As long as Paisley actually agrees to start the race, he'd be my each way bet at the festival right now.
Okay, interesting. Now, what about the chasers? You may think I'm mad, but I still think there's a big race in Asterion Forlange, though one does have to forgive his last-minute jumping errors. Am I mad? Anyway, there are my thoughts.
I don't think you are mad. He's certainly got a load of ability, but he's a tricky one to call, that's for sure. He seems to run a bad race every now and then and throw in a terrible jump when you least want it. I'm really looking forward to watching the Champion Chase, the 2 mile event, but probably more looking forward to watching it rather than betting on it, I must admit. Shishkin's long odds on, and he's having a rematch with Energumen, who he raced against at Ascot last month. And then Chacun Pour Soir's in there as well. He was fantastic at the Dublin Racing Festival. I'm never quite sure whether he's a good traveller. He hasn't run well in the times he's come over to Britain to run, but you know, if there are excuses for that and he can bounce back to his Irish form, then, you know, it's definitely a 3-way fight rather than a 2-way one. There's also others in there that are capable of picking up the pieces if the front two haven't recovered from Ascot, so that should be a cracker.
Going back to Asterion Forlange, he's got 3 entries, one of which is the Ryanair Chase. He's in the Gold Cup, and that's probably asking a bit too much of him, but he's also in the Stayers Hurdle, funny enough, but if he was in the Ryanair Chase, I might have a little look at him. As for the Gold Cup itself, well, I've gone with Tom Seagal's Pricewise and Protectorate for the Skeltons each way. So there are my thoughts. What about you?
Yeah, well, starting with the Ryanair, Fakir Dudaries came over and won the Ascot Chase. And he's currently 6th in the betting for the Ryanair behind 5 other Irish runners. Now, okay. I know that some of those are likely to end up elsewhere because they're in the Ryanair and the Gold Cup, like you mentioned with Asterion Forlange. But the fact that the front 6 in the market are all Irish doesn't say a lot for the British Challenge in that race. I'll be hoping for Allaho to win the Ryanair. He's a horse I've got a soft spot for, won it last year. And I might have a little double on the two. They're in the same ownership, Allaho and A Plutard. Listeners will remember that I'm a big fan of A Plutard, and he'd be my selection for the Gold Cup. There was a horse called Conflated that was a bit of a left field winner of the Irish Gold Cup. Seemed like a bit of a surprise to some. I don't know whether he can follow that up. And in terms of A Plutard, I'd certainly fear Minella Indo and Galvin and Album Photo, 3 more Irish runners going against my selection. But yeah, I hope A Plutard can go one better than last year.
Yeah, it'd be nice, wouldn't it? Definitely. Well, hopefully that's given our listeners a few ideas. Any other horses, Phil, that you fancy for the festival?
Well, one that I certainly want to mention is a horse called Facile Vega.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, she'll be a short price to win the bumper. But the win at the Dublin Racing Festival certainly was facile. I just said she, I meant he, actually. He's a son of a brilliant mare, Quavega. He looks capable of being as exciting as she was, and she won the Mare's Hurdle year after year at Cheltenham. So, yeah, he could be a bit special. I'm certainly looking forward to watching him. One other I'd mention is a horse called Does He Know, who was a wide margin winner of the Reynoldstown Chase at Ascot. That was on pretty soft ground, and it looked like the further he went, the better he went. So I was quite hoping he might go to the National Hunt Chase, which is a 3 mile 6 furlong race for amateur riders. But apparently he's a bit of a tricky ride, and he might need a bit more of an experienced jockey. So it looks like they might go for the Ultima Chase, which is a handicap at the festival, which is over a slightly shorter distance. I must admit he'd make a little bit less appeal for me there, as it will be quite a competitive race. But if he was to turn up in the National Hunt Chase, I would certainly be interested.
Great stuff, and I hope everyone enjoys Cheltenham. Somebody that I know will enjoy Cheltenham is this month's guest, and he's on the line now, David Armstrong from the RCA. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm good, guys. Thanks very much for inviting me on today.
Well, welcome to Inside the Rails. You're very welcome to join us. Thank you. Now, David, you always come across as a very positive person who always seems to see a bright future for British racing in spite of its many current challenges. Is that a fair assessment of you?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I do try to find the sort of the upside, the great news story. I think particularly, the opportunities we have to innovate and change this great sport. And we have so many good things going for us already. There's nearly 6 million people visiting race courses every year. We have, some of the best racing in the world. We have some of the best athletes in the world. And I think we just need to be, looking for ways to constantly innovate and improve. So I do think there's lots to be positive about.
Well, that's great. We really like positive guests on Inside the Rails. Now, I want to come on to the challenges facing racing a little bit later, but we always like to find out more about our guests and how they ended up in racing. What's the David Armstrong story and how did you get into the sport?
Well, there's probably two parts to the answer, really. Firstly, career-wise, I was actually a finance guy by training and background, worked in the city, was the CFO of a couple of FTSE companies, and was following that finance path. Sold out of a business in 2013, and I was given the opportunity to take on a project to run Wasps, the rugby club. And so moving away completely from my finance background into the sports world, in the first instance in rugby, it was a very exciting time for Wasps. We purchased the Ricoh Arena in Coventry and became the first rugby club to ever move grounds in the middle of a season. We then became the first rugby club anywhere in the world to list on a stock exchange. So we created a brand new model for Wasps. So I led the business through that, and that was very exciting. On the back of that, I got given a couple of non-exec roles in sport as well. So really became fully devoted to the sports sector and moving away from my old world in finance. That in itself moved on to, I'd left Wasps. I was looking at a couple of other opportunities, doing some consulting. And I had a call from a headhunter saying, would you be interested in horse racing in the RCA? And it's an interesting, this is where the second element comes in that many years ago, I was an owner. I had a couple of horses with a group of us with William Muir, and loved the racing experience in that sense as an owner. Always been a bit of a fan anyway, to be fair. Went racing a couple of times a year, 2-3 times a year, to different events. Always enjoyed it. So it was always something I was open to anyway. Bring those together, those two facets. And when the opportunity for the RCA came along, and particularly at such an exciting and equally challenging time for the sport, it just felt like the right thing to do.
Now, you mentioned that you were CEO of Wasps, a Premier League rugby team. How did that role compare with your current role at the RCA?
Very, very different. Some common themes, governance of sport, the funding of sport, those sorts of areas, media rights, a lot of commonalities there. But the biggest difference between a rugby team or a football team or a cricket would be the same. And racing is this piece, or certainly the RCA rule, is this piece where in rugby or cricket or football, you've got your own team. You are heavily vested in the results of that team. You can't help but be a passionate supporter of that team. With the RCA rule, and actually generally with the structure of racing, you don't quite have that. And that's, both good and bad in that, it's potentially bad in that you don't quite have that passionate link to the result of the sporting event that you're managing. It's good because it allows you to take a step back and look across the whole sport more equally. So it's a bit of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Okay. Now, we all know, don't we, that British racing has many stakeholders who all have their own vested interests. Have you noticed a greater coming together since the pandemic?
Well, I think there has been, actually. And I actually think it started during the pandemic and even towards the beginning of the pandemic, when we really were in crisis mode. And to bring the sport back quickly as we did within 11 weeks, and to successfully carry on with a near to full fixture list almost straight away through the second year of the pandemic has been testament to the fact that we did work well together. So we created at the beginning of the pandemic, you'll probably be aware, we created a COVID reaction group, which I initially chaired and then Nick Rust chaired.
Yeah.
And we brought in individuals from each part of the sport, from racecourses, from each part of the horsemen's group, and various other people, including lots of BHA staff, obviously, as well. And of course, that's really the starting point for the miraculous career of Jerry Hill as well. And his role as CMO, he's been absolutely vital for us. So we had to bring together that group of people, and there's no playbook. There's no binder on a shelf you go to say, what do you do if you have a global pandemic? So we were sort of making it up as we went along. And by working together as a group, we ended up with a much better solution than I think the existing structure would have come up with on its own. Because we had to, we didn't have a choice. People always joke about, well, how did you plan out the pandemic? How did you know what you were going to do? It all seemed to go very well. So, well, thanks so much for the compliment, but we're literally making it up by the day. And I think with some wise advice from different people, we made a lot of good decisions in those early days, and I think that's what kept us in good stead for the rest of the pandemic.
That's interesting, David. But can you give us a bit of an insight into, because I must admit it's something I'm interested in. What do you actually do at the RCA? What's the day-to-day role? What does that involve?
I can't answer that. Then everybody will know I don't do anything. But no, I think the RCA's got its own strategy and operating plan that we work to. We've got a team that are involved in, effectively, it's one of those parts is what we do in relation to racing in the fixture list. So we represent racecourses in the creation of the fixture list, the funding processes behind that, and approval with the BHA, integration and liaison with the levy board. And then the other half of what we do, if you like, is connected to racecourse services. So we provide a range of support services to racecourses in respect of turf management, in terms of recruitment, HR, finance, purchasing, marketing services in particular is a key area for us. So we provide a lot of support like that to individual racecourses. And then sort of as well as managing across those different activities, my role, I'm also a director of the BHA, a director of the levy board, and sit on the exec committee as well. So therefore, I've got that sort of governance-y aspect to my day-to-day as well. So it's a mixture of all of the above, really.
Brilliant. And in terms of shared ownership, obviously, as a podcast, we're huge promoters of shared ownership. And I know I mentioned to the listeners earlier that we met last year at Windsor, and I can remember you being very positive about syndicates and racing clubs. Can I ask you how important you think they are to racing, and what you're hoping to see from racecourses to make the syndicate ownership experience even better in the future?
Well, I think syndicates are an absolutely vital part of how we go forward as a sport. I mean, they already are playing a key role, but I think that's going to get bigger and bigger as time goes on. Being able to give individuals the opportunity to be part of the ownership structure of the sport is vitally important. In recent surveys that we've done, and you've probably done as well, an awful lot of people think that owning a racehorse is outside their budget, is something they'll never be able to do. And we need to change that myth, don't we? Because you can be a member of a syndicate, one of these large syndicates for, 50 quid, 100 quid, and for that person, even though they only own a tiny percentage of, the horse, they feel as though it's their horse. It's their day at the races. It's their part of it. And there might be 3,000 of them. There might be 10 of them, whatever it is. Though for those moments when that horse runs, that's their horse. And that passion they get as their horse is absolutely vital, and it's addictive, and it brings people into our sport. So I think that's very important. And I think the comparison that some people often draw with, I'm going to talk about a little bit about Australia, where I think I'm right in saying 1 in 290 people own a share of a horse. And what that means, and again, it's small percentages and all of that sort of thing. But syndicate ownership in Australia is much wider spread than it is here. To me, that's how you bring people in. People need to participate. Everyone's talking at the moment about things like NFTs and digital marketing and things like that. That's another way of doing the same thing. That's giving an individual person a chance to be part of our sport for a short period of time in some limited but valuable way. And that's what syndicate ownership is. So you ask the question what more racecourses can do to help with syndicates. And I think the challenge racecourses have is that, as syndicate numbers grow and grow and grow, it's just practically next to impossible for them to be able to admit every syndicate member to the racecourse. So, racecourses will strive to try and bring as many syndicate members as possible to the racecourse, either in an owners and trainers area, or potentially as general admission as well. And then on top of that, we'll try and get as many of those people into the parade ring as they can. Other